Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the American people have a lot on our minds this week about things happening in our world and in our country. But today we turn our attention to something at home. And the United States Senate, the Congress, and I believe the President, by the end of the week, will have a Christmas present for 50 million children and 3.4 million teachers in 100,000 public schools across this country, something they've been eagerly awaiting. Today, the Senate should pass by a large margin our bill to fix No Child Left Behind. A lot has been said about how the bill repeals the Common Core mandate, how it reverses a trend toward a national school board that has gone on through the last two presidential administrations, and how it is the biggest step toward local control in a quarter of a century, local control of public schools. That's all true. The legislation specifically prohibits the United States Secretary of Education from specifying in any state that it must have the Common Core standards or any other academic standards, not just this secretary, but future secretaries. It gets rid of the waivers that the United States Department of Education has been using to act in effect as a national school board, causing governors to have to come to Washington and play Mother May I if they want to evaluate teachers or fix low-performing schools or set their own academic standards. And it is true that it moves a great many decisions at home. It is the single biggest step toward local control of schools in 25 years. But this morning, Mr. President, as we come to a vote, which we will do at 10:45, I'd like to emphasize something else. I believe that the passage of this legislation, and if it is signed later this week, as I believe it will be by President Obama, will unleash a flood of innovation and excellence in student achievement across America, community by community and state by state. Why do I say that? Because look at where the innovation has come from before. My own state, Tennessee, was the first state to pay teachers more for teaching well, creating a master teacher program in the 1980s. Florida came right behind. That didn't come from Washington. The Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota created what we now call charter schools in the early 1990s. That didn't come from Washington. The governors themselves met with President George H.W. Bush in 1989 to establish national education goals, not directed from Washington, but with governors working together, with the president involved in leading the way, providing the bully pulpit support. And then the governors since that time have been setting higher standards, devising tests to see how well students were doing to reach those standards, creating their own state accountability systems, finding more ways to evaluate teachers fairly. My own state has done pretty well without Washington's supervision, starting with the master teacher program in the 80s, and then Governor McWhorter in his time in the 90s helped Tennessee pioneer to relate student achievement to teacher performance. And then Governor Bredesen, a Democratic governor, realized that our standards were really low. We were kidding ourselves. So he, working with other governors, pushed them up higher. And then our current governor, Bill Haslam, has taken it even further, and our children are leading the country in student achievement gains. So the states themselves have been the source of innovation and excellence over the last 30 years. And we've learned something else by the last 10 or 15 years. Too much Washington involvement causes a backlash. You can't have a civil conversation about Common Core in Tennessee or many other states. It is the #1 issue in Republican primaries, even in general elections, mainly because Washington got involved with it. Now Washington's out of it, and it's up to Tennessee and Washington and every state to decide for themselves what their academic standards ought to be. Same with teacher evaluation. I was in a year-and-a-half brawl with the National Education Association in 1983 and 84 as governor when we paid teachers more for teaching well. It carried by one vote in our state Senate. And so when I came to Washington a few years ago, people said, well, Senator Alexander's going to want every state to do that. They were absolutely wrong about that. The last thing we should do is tell states they must evaluate teachers and how to evaluate teachers. It's hard enough to do without somebody looking over your shoulder. So too much Washington involvement has actually made it harder to have higher standards and harder to evaluate teachers. And I believe that we're changing that this week. I had dinner with a Democratic senator last night who plans to vote for the bill. He said he would have given me 5-to-1 odds at the beginning of the year that we wouldn't have been able to pass this bill. Why are we at the point where we are, where we're likely to get votes in the mid-80s today in favor of the bill? Number one, because we've worked on it in a bipartisan way. And I've given credit many times to Senator Murray from Washington, D.C. from the state of Washington for suggesting how we do that. And I see Senator Mikulski from Maryland on the floor, who's been a force for that as well. Our committee worked in a bipartisan way. So did the House of Representatives as we worked through the conference. The President and his staff members and Secretary Duncan have been professional and straightforward in dealing with us all year long, and I'm grateful for that. And we knew from the beginning, and we said to the President, Mr. President, we know we can't change the law. We can't fix No Child Left Behind unless we have your signature. We know that. And he dealt with us in a straightforward way. And then we found a consensus. And once we found that consensus, it made a very difficult problem a lot easier. And the consensus is this. We keep the important measurements of student achievement so that parents and teachers and schools will know how schools and teachers and parents are doing. That's 17 tests designed by the states, administered from the 3rd grade through the 12th grade, about 2 hours per test. That's not very many tests. Keep those, report the results, disaggregate the results, and then leave it to classroom teachers, to school boards, and to states the decisions about what to do about the tests. That should result in better tests and fewer tests. That consensus underpins the success we've had. 6 years ago in December, we had a big disagreement in this chamber. We passed the Affordable Care Act with all the Democrats voting yes and all the Republicans voting no. And the next day, the Republicans went out and started trying to repeal it, and we haven't stopped. That's what happened with that kind of debate. This is a different kind of day. If the president signs this bill, as I believe he will, the next day, people aren't going to be trying to repeal it. Governors, school board members, teachers are going to be able to implement it, and they'll go to work doing it. They'll be deciding what tests to give, what schools to fix and how to fix them, what the higher academic standards ought to be, what kind of tests should be there. It'll be their decisions. They're free to do it from the day the president signs this bill. It only lasts for 4 years until it's supposed to be reauthorized, but my guess is that this bill and the policies within it will set the standard for policy in elementary and secondary education from the federal level for the next 2 decades. It's a compromise, but it's a very well-crafted piece of work. It's good policy. There's some things that are undone, Senator Murray has her list of things that couldn't get in the bill, and I have mine. I was glad to see us make some more progress on charter schools. I've watched that go from the time I was education secretary in the early 90s when I wrote a letter to every school superintendent asking them to try at least one of those Minnesota start from scratch schools. Watched it go from there to today where 5% of our children in public schools go to charter public schools. That's a lot of kids, 5 million, 6 million children. Schools where teachers have more freedom and parents have more choices. What we haven't made as much progress on is giving low-income parents more choices of schools for their children. So they have the same kind of opportunity that better off financially parents do. My scholarship for kids proposal only got 44 votes here. I thought it was a very good idea that it would give states the option, not a mandate, to turn all their federal education dollars into scholarships for children, for low-income children, that'd be $2,100 for each of those children, and it would follow them to the school their parent chose, under the state's rules, not Washington's rules. But that's not a part of this bill. But we can fight about that, discuss that another day, and I intend to try to do that. But today I think we celebrate the fact that we've come to a very good conclusion. We're sending to the President a bill I hope he will be comfortable with. And while it does repeal the Common Core mandate, and it does reverse the trend to a national school board, and it is the biggest step toward local control in 25 years, what excites me about the bill is I believe it will unleash a flood of innovation and excellence in elementary and secondary education that will be a wonderful Christmas present for 50 million children in 100,000 public schools being taught by 3.4 million teachers. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
President.